Hello everybody and welcome. I know I didn't promise a video and I've already inundated you with quite a bit of my older videos to sort of help you along as you're reading, but I just thought that I'd check in with you. As I told you, I would be looking at this class and spending some time on it every Tuesday, and I'm doing that today. I'm still having a little bit of a problem with my voice, but it's not as bad as it was, so I'm going to take that as a win. What I really wanted to do in this video was give you an overview in a chronological order of the types of rhetoric and theory that we are studying. And some of this you'll notice in your readings as we go along. Now, I'm also making this video because I want to encourage you to keep reading and to, not give up on it, but also that the reading is very important. So this is one of my ways of doing that. And hopefully by not giving you minuscule little assignments or a ton of papers or anything like that, that you'll spend that time reading. That's really my goal. So however much time you set aside for this class every week, I would love it if you could spend the majority of that actually reading and watching the videos while you read, or however it is that you do it. If you like to watch the videos first, then read, or if you like to read first, then watch the videos to know what you're looking for, whatever. However you do it is fine by me. But I did want to give you a quick overview since I decided to videotape today. I said tape as if like that is a thing anymore. It's really not, is it? So you already know that right now we're really studying ancient rhetoric. We call it the classical period, classical Greece, classical Romans. We start there. And honestly, it really defines rhetoric, or the scope of rhetoric, I should say, until about the 20th century. So we've got some time to spend with these authors in order to understand the foundation for the rest of them. And honestly, even in the 20th century and the 21st too, it's really about criticizing those theorists. So we have to understand them really well before we do anything else and before we try to understand something. So we spend a lot of time on the classical Greeks and the classical Romans, and that's why. Some people ask me, why do we spend all this time with these philosophers? And it's because they do set the stage. And I'm sure as you're pursuing your scholarly goals in your master's degree, and if you decide to go in for a PhD, this will definitely be true, you have to learn it. So taking one class in something and then saying, okay, I know it, that's not true. We know that that's not how that works. So each class should be an advancement, not just in terms of the assignments that you're given, or what the professor does, or how the professor talks about things, or how much depth we go into, but also for you. You should be making that extra effort to really understand where things come from and what the history, or what Foucault referred to as the archaeology of knowledge, really does to impact our knowledge of rhetorical theory in this case. So that's why we spend so much time on ancient rhetoric. After ancient rhetoric, we will hit medieval rhetoric. And of course, what's fascinating, of course, is that the medieval period covers the most of the 2,500 years that we're looking at. And yet we spend the least time on it because we have the least from it. You had a church that was in charge of the truth, and so questioning wasn't really a thing, and you had the books coming from the church, and you had only certain people who could read, and we had the feudal system, so generations of families that were stuck tilling land and not going outside of even the fiefdom that they were on. So it's a long period of time and very little by way of rhetoric. However, we do know that during this period, when the church was burning the old texts, the Islamic monks, as well as some other cultures, were preserving those texts. So we have some of them, thank goodness. So in the medieval period, we'll cover St. Augustine. You could say Augustine if you want, by the way. I usually say Augustine. So that's where either one's fine. St. Augustine, Margaret Fell, we'll study her a little bit, Christine de Pizan. And that's pretty much it for the medieval period. So, depending on what historian you talk to, anywhere from 800 to 1600 years covered by three theorists, which is less about theory, more about practice, as we're going to learn. After that comes Renaissance rhetoric, which of course is when we think that there would be a burst of the use of rhetoric, and there was, but there was also a real debate about what rhetoric was supposed to do. Was it supposed to be pretty, or was it supposed to make an argument and persuade? Was it about speaking, or was it about reasoning out the truth? Well, that's a real challenge to what we've been doing before. During the ancient period in Rome, we were really looking at a conflict between rhetoric and philosophy, how we go about discovering what is good in life and what we should be doing in life. And in Roman times, we really learned about rhetoric and power, right? Where we are looking at two different theorists from two different governing entities, two different governing styles. You had Cicero during the Roman Republic, and of course Quintilian during the Roman Empire, and that really shows us the relationship between power and rhetoric. The more centralized the government, like the empire, the less need there was for rhetoric. And Quintilian knew that. He knew he could be killed for practicing rhetoric, just like Cicero was. And of course, in the Republic, the people have more power, so it was a more decentralized system, and the need for rhetoric was great. So the more centralized the government, the less you need rhetoric. The more decentralized, the more you need rhetoric. And if you took 350 with me, you heard that a lot. So in the medieval period, then what are we really looking at? Well, obviously God knew the truth, and God spoke the truth, and God didn't allow us to debate that because you couldn't win an argument with God. So the church took that mantle on. So really what we have is this real challenge between the church and rhetoric, and what rhetoric could do and what rhetoric could not do, whether or not it was okay to use or whether it was a tool, etc. During the Renaissance, of course, as I just said, we have this split between the aesthetic and they call it science sometimes. Most of the time it's called reasoning. And so it's really between rhetoric as an aesthetic practice or rhetoric as a reasoning or scientific practice. So is it for discovering the truth, or is it for simply saying pretty things? And of course, this is where we, now draw from Peter Ramus and others on rhetoric as empty, flowery language, because at this point we start talking about that as the Renaissance says come along. They start dividing the sort of job of rhetoric as just being pretty and not so much about being persuasive. And then during the Enlightenment, of course, they were trying to just simply reject everything that we had learned. They were trying to reject all the foundations that we had learned. And so they started challenging how we looked at rhetoric as to what it could and could not do. And of course, during this time, it could be pretty, but was poetry rhetoric? Was it rhetorical in some way? And yeah, I guess it could be used to reason out something, but really, is reasoning ever, is science something that comes from an individual, or does it come from a method of analysis? And of course, the answer is a method of analysis. So we also have the rise of the humanists. Wow, that sounded almost demonic, like the rise of the humanists. It's very, very scary. No, I'm just kidding. The humanists, of course, were those who felt that God wasn't the only one who would be able to tell us what our lives were like on earth, that our experiences, the empirical experiences that we have were valuable, and even the interpretive experiences that we had were valuable, and therefore humans do play a huge part in the impact of science, and the impact of rhetoric, and the impact of the arts, etc. And so the humanists drawing that away from God and into the human experience was really a marker for the Enlightenment, because it allowed people to say, I'm going to use rhetoric to explain science to you. So the sort of birth of the rhetoric of science under Vico comes out during the age of the Enlightenment. Since then, we have the category that most people use is just contemporary rhetoric, the rhetoric of the time. Some people just skipped over the modern period, apparently. I'm not really sure why. I guess contemporary and modern. And of course, modern rhetoric is defined by following rules, argument structure, very specific, linear, progressive, deductive, inductive argument structures that are very easy to follow. And the postmodernists come along and say, we want to interrupt that. We want to change that. We want to talk about these things differently. One example is, in a lot of presidential speeches, if you watch the presidential debates from 1960, you'll see Kennedy and Nixon using evidence and arguing back and forth from that evidence. Well, now we're more into narrative. And the reason that we're in the narrative and storytelling is because that's more salient with the audience. And so what rhetoric did was it came along and said, stop using these data-driven statements, start using stories, at least in part of it, to help people understand it better, because rhetoric is really a practice of persuasion, and that's more persuasive. And so it wasn't like we had the modern era and then the postmodern era. They don't follow each other. They're sort of currently kind of competing, I would say, or maybe they're falling out of debate, because why are we still debating that? It seems like we've settled that argument, but maybe I have in my head and no one else has, I don't know. I don't really read up on the arguments between modernists and postmodernists anymore, because I probably cannot name one person that I know is a good communication theorist that, their main thing is putting themselves either as a postmodernist or a modernist and saying, here, we need to advocate for a particular way of thinking. Most of us understand that the postmodern ideas have brought to the modern ideas some really big improvements. For example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in helping us understand that reality doesn't just exist in the empirical, but that reality exists also in the way that we construct things linguistically. That's a very important part of how I use communication and how I theorize about communication. Therefore, it's something that really needed to be brought to the realm of rhetoric in order to make it more salient with the moderns and going forward. It's the only thing that's going to save rhetoric. Otherwise, it would be outdated. It would be considered patriarchal. It would be considered terrible. And of course, it would, and that makes sense to me. It would also be considered way too dictatorial. Like, you have to use evidence of this type in this way for this purpose. And even though that's exactly what Aristotle says, by the way, which is what the topoi are for when you get to Aristotle and you read about it, but this is why I say we have to really understand the classical theories in order to be able to understand the more modern theories. And so there we have that. So last but not least, I wanted to mention, I don't think this is a separate category. I don't think it should be a separate category, but people always put it in a separate category, and that's women's rhetoric. And I might sound a little bit cavalier saying I don't want it to be a separate category, and it's just that I feel like it's already in every other category. I mean, I guess at some point I'm a human at heart. I believe that all of us deserve as much attention as the next. And do I believe that the patriarchy has ruled for a long time and that women need to make more strides? Yes. Do I believe that women have made some strides? Absolutely. Do I think it's done yet? No, I don't. But at the same time, I don't see it as some sort of violent revolution that happens overnight. I see it as progression as we go along. And if we start talking about people, as human beings, and not as woman, man, male, female, etc., that we will be able to do better and give the treatment better to people. But that does not change the fact that, for example, I think my most recent publication, which was a year ago or so, a year and a half ago maybe, is really about why Hillary Clinton could never win the presidency. And it has nothing to do with her being Hillary Clinton. It has to do with women as speaker and why looking at women differently is problematic, okay? And of course you can disagree with that. That's a debatable thing, and it's totally okay. And honestly, I haven't worked my feelings out about it just yet. But it's no longer about persuasion. Women's rhetoric is really about how women and women's issues, or those who identify as women and those who identify with women's issues, which we know can be sexed differently than they're gendered, but you could be sexed male and be cisgender and straight and whatever else, but you still want to write about women's issues because you feel that they're important. That's acceptable too. So we've sort of moved to trying to make sense of the role that people play. And a lot of times people say it's male versus female. It's like, maybe. Do we know that certain people communicate differently than others? Yeah, but I mean, I'm a masculine communicator, right? But I'm a cisgendered straight woman. So what do you do with that? Do you say this is a cisgendered straight woman who is married but who communicates like a man? That doesn't even make sense. Why would anybody say that? Of course not. So the terms masculine and feminine suddenly become problematic. Why? They're very binary. I mean, that's the first problem, obviously. But secondarily, because they are sort of not inclusive of not just different genders, but also of thoughts. I mean, if I have to think certain things because I'm female, that's really problematic. And if you have to think certain things because you are a cisgendered straight male, that seems problematic. And so I feel like what we've done is really drawn a line and said, here it is, either you're this or you're that. That's silly. That's what I think that a lot of women in rhetoric are trying to get rid of, not trying to do. And so that area of study is really fascinating. But the idea that there's a separate rhetoric for women is something that I've been exploring in my own world for a long time. Is there a separate rhetoric for women? Is there a women's rhetoric? What does that mean if there is? So those are some of the questions that we're going to deal with, and that's the chronological order of the things that you're reading. I know you're like on Aristotle right now, and you're like, dear Lord, we've got a long ways to go. Yes, we do, but we have 16 weeks to do it. So hopefully the reading is going well. I'm about to go on Blackboard, post this, and also check and see if you guys have any questions or anything going on. Like I said, it will be Tuesdays that I spend exclusively on this class. So, all right, I'll catch you next time.